There are lots of players in baseball today that are hated for various different reasons. And as I'm sure you know by now, today I'm going to be looking at each team's most hated player. Now with this video, it was a little hard to find a hated player on every single team. There are a couple teams across baseball where really I don't think they have anyone that's hated. So in that case, I just picked a player that may be hated by the fan base itself because they're not the best player or they're underperforming due to their contract. But for most teams, I'm going to be looking at the most hated, disliked player, whatever you want to call it, from the general fan's perspective. So with that in mind, let's get right into this. Starting off with the Arizona Diamondbacks, I'm going with Madison Bumgarner. Bumgarner's had his fair share of drama over the years, and he's really grown to be one of baseball's most hated players. Just a couple years ago, he flipped out at Max Muncy for smoking a home run off of him into McCovey Cove, and he's sort of just like a boomer. He's not really likable, and I think a lot of people dislike him. Moving on to the Atlanta Braves, I'm going with Marcell Ozuna. Just a couple years back, Ozuna was arrested for domestic violence where he choked his wife, and just this past year, he was arrested again for DUI. So pretty self-explanatory, Ozuna is clearly the Braves' most hated player. Getting on to the Baltimore Orioles, I have Bruce Zimmerman. Now this is really the first instance in where I don't think there's necessarily any hated players on the team, but Zimmerman last year posted a 6 ERA, and in terms of the Orioles fan base, I would assume they're not his biggest fan because he was really bad last year. In fact, there's really nothing to hate about Zimmerman. I just wasn't sure who to pick, and he just wasn't that good last year, so I just went with him. Getting on to the Boston Red Sox, I'm going with Tommy Pham. There were a couple other candidates here in Jarren Duran and Reese McGuire for what they've done in the past, but I think Pham tops them both. As most of us know by now, Pham last year slapped Jock Peterson across the face over a fantasy football league, so that really explains all you need to know about Tommy Pham. Getting on to the White Sox, I have Yoan Moncada. The White Sox are a team similar to the Orioles that really don't have any universally hated players, but I wouldn't be surprised to hear about a lot of White Sox fans disliking him because of how bad he's been ever since getting traded there for Chris Sale. Moving on to the Cubs, I have Marcus Stroman. Stroman really isn't a bad guy, but I could see why a lot of people dislike him. He seems to get in a lot of Twitter arguments and seems to have pretty much everyone blocked on that site, so as a millionaire, Major League Baseball player, you should have better things to do than arguing on Twitter. Getting on to the Cincinnati Reds, I have Hunter Strickland. Strickland to this day I think is still disliked by some fans across baseball for his altercation involving Bryce Harper and Mike Morse, which also ended his career. He sort of reminds me of Madison Bumgarner. He just seems to get upset over a lot of things, and I think he's the most disliked or hated player on the Reds. Moving on to the Cleveland Guardians, I have Zach Plesac. There was a couple other players like Josh Naylor and James Karinchak that I could have went with because of the flair they played the game with, which could upset other teams, but I personally don't mind it. I think Plesac is a little bit more hated because he just unnecessarily punched the mound, and I think he was out for quite a while, and he just seems to have a temper and doesn't want to listen to anyone. Getting on to the Colorado Rockies, I have Jose Urena. Urena has been in many altercations in the past involving Ronald Acuna Jr., who he seems to hit purposefully almost any chance he gets. So consistently plunking one of the best players in the game today is not going to get you a good rap. Moving on to the Detroit Tigers, I have Javier Baez. This is another team that I really don't think has anyone that's universally hated, but I think Tiger fans probably don't like Baez for how bad he was this past year. There's really nothing to dislike about Baez in terms of his personality, it's just his bad play, and I wouldn't be surprised to hear a lot of Tigers fans disliking him. Getting on to the Houston Astros, I have Jose Altuve. You guys know what he did and why he's so hated, so let's not waste any time here. Getting on to the Kansas City Royals, I have Amir Garrett. I can see why some people would dislike Garrett because of the drama he's had over the years with Javier Baez. He seems to be sort of a Madison Bumgarner type, so I don't think many people like him. Also talks like he's one of the best relievers in the game, and he's simply not. Moving on to the Angels, I have Ryan Tepera. Back in the 2021 playoffs, Tepera was pitching for the White Sox against the Houston Astros where he got blown up, and after the outing he accused the Astros of cheating when in reality he just sucks. Next up we have the Los Angeles Dodgers where I'm going with Trevor Bauer. I know Bauer hasn't pitched in a while, but the last team he did pitch for was the Dodgers, so I'm going to count him as a Dodger, and he was in the past accused of sexual assault, so I can see why a lot of people dislike him. Now, I personally believe this could be a lie. I'm not sure. I don't know any insider information, but I would hope Bauer's guilty, but as of right now, he's hated by lots of people. Next up, I have the Miami Marlins, where I'm going with Jazz Chisholm. The way Jazz Chisholm carries himself really doesn't bother me at all. But he's very flashy, he plays the game with a lot of emotion, he does some showboating, and I don't have a problem with that like I said, but I think a lot of people do, and I think a lot of people dislike him. Next up we have the Brewers, where I'm going with Keston Hiura. Another team that I really couldn't find anyone universally hated. I don't hate anyone on the Brewers, but I think Hiura's inconsistency over the past couple years could be frustrating to Brewer fans. So nothing wrong with Hiura at all, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Brewer fans don't like him because he's just been a letdown. Getting on to the Minnesota Twins, I have Carlos Correa. Yeah, he's technically a free agent, but the last team he played for was the Twins, and I think a lot of people really hate him. Obviously because of his involvement in the Astros cheating scandal, and afterwards he really stood up for himself when he blatantly got caught, so I can see why a lot of people hate him. Moving on to the New York Mets, I have Pete Alonso. I don't really dislike Alonso, but I think a lot of people would agree with me here that he takes the home run derby a little too seriously. And I think for that reason, a lot of people sort of feel like he's a cringy type of player. I mean, I don't hate him by any means, but I can see why people dislike him. Moving on to the Yankees, I have Domingo Germán. Germán, a couple years back, was suspended 80 plus games for domestic violence, and since then he's threatened to retire, and he just seems like he's all over the place. He doesn't really seem mentally all there, but for a person who has domestic abuse cases hanging over their head, I really have no respect for him. Moving on to the Oakland A's, I have Ramon Laureano. Laureano, a couple years back, was busted for PEDs, and for that reason, I think a lot of people hate him. No one likes to see players cheating in baseball, and especially players who lie about it, and that's exactly what Laureano did. Next up, I have the Philadelphia Phillies, where I'm going with Bryce Harper. The Phillies are a pretty likable team. In fact, I don't really think there's many hated players on their roster. But I think Harper, with all the pedigree he's had and talent throughout his career, and now the fact that he's living up to it, I think some of his haters are really coming out, and I think there's still to this day a lot of people that dislike him. Getting on to the Pittsburgh Pirates, I have Bryce Wilson. Another case here where absolutely nothing wrong with the guy, but he had a 5+ ERA last year, so I'm pretty sure Pirates fans probably don't love him. Moving on to the San Diego Padres, I have Fernando Tatis Jr. This is another pretty self-explanatory one. Tatis was suspended 80 games this past season for PEDs, and again, he seemed to lie about it. But if there's a player who can ever revive his reputation, it's Tatis. He's going to come back next year and hopefully light up the league. Moving on to the San Francisco Giants, I'm going with Zach Littell. Yeah, he's technically a free agent, but I'm going to count him as a Giant for this video, and I can see why a lot of people hate him. This past season, he got pulled from an outing, and he publicly shamed his manager out on the mound in front of everyone, which is something you don't do, especially considering he's not a good pitcher. Getting on to the Seattle Mariners, I have Jared Kelenic. Another player here that I don't really think is universally hated, but I think the Mariners dislike him because he's not been good ever since getting called up, and he seems to sort of have an attitude issue. I do like Kelenic, I don't want to rag on him, but I do think a lot of Mariner fans dislike him. Next up, I have the St. Louis Cardinals, where I'm going with Dylan Carlson. Another player who has nothing wrong with his character whatsoever. I honestly feel kind of bad for putting him on the list, but he has been underwhelming since getting called up. And being a former top prospect, I wouldn't be surprised to hear a lot of Cardinal fans disliking him. Next up, we have the Tampa Bay Rays, where I'm going with Luis Patino. Another instance here where nothing wrong with the guy's character, but he was a former top prospect, and last year he posted an 8+ ERA. So I think with his awful play this past season, a lot of Tampa Bay fans probably don't like him. Next up, we have the Texas Rangers, where I'm going with Bayron Lora. Many of you may not know the name because he hasn't hit the big leagues yet, but he was involved in a fatal car crash recently which killed a passenger. And since then, he's been suspended for his off-the-field issues, so I'm assuming he is likely to be at fault for that death, and he's just not a likable person. Moving on to the Toronto Blue Jays, I have Alek Manoah. This is a case similar to Bryce Harper in the sense that people hate him because he's good. Manoah is one of the best pitchers in the game today, but he has lots of confidence and attitude out there on the mound, and I think that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. And finally, getting on to the Washington Nationals, I have Steven Strasburg. I don't think there's anything wrong with Strasburg's character, but I think a lot of National fans probably don't like him because he's only pitched in 30 innings since 2020. Being constantly injured is nothing that's Strasburg's fault, but it can go the wrong way in terms of the fan base when you're getting paid lots of money. Alright, so that's going to wrap today's video up. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.